Afternoon, Yukon government. My name is Ashley Casius. I'm the director of the Diversity Inclusion Branch here at the Public Service Commission. I'm very happy to be welcoming you to our ongoing conversations with diversity. Very proud to acknowledge that we're coming to you from the traditional territory of the Quan Council and the Quan First Nation. And again, thank you again for joining us for this very special opportunity to hear from a very honored speaker who I'm very happy to be introducing here very shortly. If you're new to Conversations with Diversity, it's an ongoing speaker series. Here within our shop, we recognize that very often individuals don't have the opportunity to meet people from different walks of life. And we feel it's so important to bring people together and really, for the purposes of sharing their own lived experiences, their own challenges, and what that means to be a Yukoner and a Canadian broadly. So working towards that endeavor, we've really tried to put together a series of different speakers from all different categories and walks of life and all different sorts of experiences. And we're here again to bring you our latest edition of that. So really it's about finding common ground across difference, and that's really what our series is all about. Very important month, the month of May. It is Asian Heritage Month. And it really brings us an opportunity for us to learn more about the diverse cultures and histories of Asian communities in Canada, and as well to acknowledge the many achievements and contributions of people of Asian origin, who throughout our history have done so much to make the country we know today what it is. Before I turn it over to our honored speaker, just a few housekeeping, all that normal stuff that we always get into, technology. So to help with consistent streaming of this presentation, we recommend that you close all of your other applications except for this web browser. If for whatever reason your screen does freeze, just click on the browser refresh button and the presentation should resume. There are a few options viewable in the actions bar below, including Q&A, chat, and raise hands. After the speech concludes, we're going to have the opportunity for questions. And I'm just going to encourage you to use that Q&A function to type in your questions, and I'll be responsible for bringing those questions forward to our speaker. Or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you in order to ask your question. This presentation is best viewed in full screen mode. If you're not in full screen mode now, just click on the arrows in the top right of this video screen. If you're not in full screen mode, there may be issues with the QA function. So just all those great things. And before I introduce our special guest here, I just want to put acknowledgement out to our technical crew, the one and only Ronnie Sous-Barbier. We've recently lost her to secondment, but she's such a diehard Yukon government employee that she actually came back to help us out run this thing. So thank you so much, Ronnie Sue, for being the technical wizard that you are in the background. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our honored guest here. I would like to welcome Deputy Minister Daniel Quan Watson to the conversation. And excuse me for reading, but he has quite the list of accomplishments here that I don't want to miss anything here. Daniel Quan Watson is a proud public servant who is passionate about the role that public institutions play in shaping Canada and the lives of Canadians. His appointment at Crown Indigenous Relations in Northern Affairs Canada is his 5th appointment as a Deputy Minister, having been Deputy Minister and previously Associate Deputy Minister of Western Economic Diversification, Chief Human Resources Officer for the Government of Canada, and Chief Executive Officer of Parks Canada. And actually talking to a friend who works for Parks Canada here with the feds, I understand that Daniel Quan Watson is not a stranger to the territory. I'm very happy to hear that. Much of his career has been focused on work with Indigenous peoples and issues, having been the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Policy and Strategic Direction at the former Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, Director General of the Aboriginal Justice Directorate at the Federal Department of Justice, and Director of Aboriginal and Territorial Relations at INAC's Northwest Territories Regional Office. With the Government of British Columbia, he was the Director of Treaty Implementation and Settlement Legislation, where he led the development of the Niska Final Agreement, among other initiatives. And with the Government of Saskatchewan, where he was responsible for first negotiations between Provincial Department of Education and what was then the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, very interesting part because I'm a Saskatchewan boy, so I'm always looking for the Saskatchewan connections all the time. In the context of these positions, he played key roles in the negotiation of modern treaties, specific claims, and many other agreements and processes. He was also lead for several key legislation initiatives, legislation files, and alternative justice programs. He has worked with Inuit, Métis, First Nation government communities and entities in every jurisdiction across Canada, and has lived in BC, Alberta, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec, true Canadian. Beyond his experience, Daniel has significant background in economic development and innovation issues, federal, provincial, territorial relations, labor relations, and human resource issues, as well as cultural and ecological heritage matters. He has represented Canada on numerous issues at forums around the world and has represented the federal government in several national, federal, provincial, territorial forums. Interestingly enough, Daniel is a pilot and sang for a time with the Regina Philharmonic Choir, has taught firearms safety and hunting courses, and has represented Canada in French, English, and Spanish. His record for riding a Harley Davidson from Ottawa to Edmonton is 46 hours and 10 minutes, and one which he has no intentions ever to try to beat again. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Minister Quan Watson. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Ash, for that wonderful greeting. I got to work on that biography and cut it down by about 90%. But it is a real pleasure to be here with you and to have the opportunity to talk to folks today. I'm just, as we speak here, seeing if I can get another photo up for a bit. You mentioned that I have spent a fair bit of time over the years in Yukon, and that is the case. I've been up to Ivavik National Park when I was the CEO of Parks Canada, been to Whitehorse and Haines and many other places many times over the years. But the photo that I'm hoping will show up here shortly that I can share with you is when I was the head of the Mexico-Canada Heads of National Park Services. And we would get together every year. And what would happen is if it was the Mexicans' turn to bring us somewhere, they would bring us somewhere in Mexico, of course, which is always sunny and warm. The Americans would always bring us to Hawaii or somewhere like that, which was, of course, always a great opportunity. And it was my time to decide where we were going to go when people came to Canada. And I decided that we would go to Yukon. And not only would we go to Yukon, but we would go to Yukon in January. And I became a hero to not only the Americans, but especially the head of the Mexican National Park Service, because he had never before been on snow or on a frozen lake. And if I can get the photo here shown for a bit, I took them all out to Kathleen Lake, which they enjoyed enormously. And I have a photo of the head of the Mexican National Park Service on that lake, if I can ever find it here. And let's just say he had the time of his life. And so the Americans did sun, the Mexicans did sun. I did Yukon in January, and they had the best time. So there's one of my Yukon stories. It's not showing up yet, but we'll see if we can find the photo here. I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory and the home of the Métis Nation of Alberta, a place that some would call Edmonton. And I don't know if others were able to see the video that was playing that I was watching earlier on, talking about the Komagata-Maru and a number of other incidences. And the photo behind me and the document that you see behind me is one that is very much a part of my history and my family's history. For those of you who have heard of the head tax and the head tax certificates, this is behind me a head tax certificate. And in fact, it is the head tax certificate of my grandfather, Quan, or as he took the English name, it was Donald Quan. And so you can see the certificate there. He was 12 years old, and I'm showing it to you not just because of the speech that I'm doing today, and not just because it's Asian Heritage Month, but because if you can see the date on it, this Friday, it will be exactly 100 years since he was granted that certificate. And that he paid $500 for, and that was targeted against only Chinese immigrants. And it was one that was worth about 2 years worth of wages, basically a way to try to minimize immigration. And he beat the Exclusion Act by 7 weeks exactly. And the arrival of the Exclusion Act, which meant that basically it was impossible for people from China to enter Canada as immigrants after that, kept my grandmother out of Canada for another 29 years until 1952, kept my birth father out of Canada until 1952. Now, as I mentioned, Friday will be the 100th anniversary of his arrival. And in addition to getting a head tax certificate, his arrival was marked in a book that was kept differently for people of Chinese ancestry than everyone else. And that was called the Record of Chinese, or the Registry, sorry, of Chinese Immigration. And that document has been kept. And we actually are going to go, a number of us from the family, to Library and Archives Canada, where they will bring out the actual register that has his name handwritten in it for his arrival, which will be exactly 100 years to the day before that. What's also interesting, though, is my Uncle Bill, who's now 90 years old and still living, will also participate in that ceremony. And we have the actual register from his arrival in 1949. And he will be on screen on Zoom, much like we are now for many of us, to enable to see that document going back to that period of time. And so all week long, I have been using the head tax certificate as the background for all of my different calls, because it tells a part of the story that is important for us to remember. Now, there are some other chapters to this, obviously. The work that he did, the work that his brother did, who is 3 years older than him, who arrived a couple years earlier, the work that their children did, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, have helped to weave the fabric of the country that we know today as Canada. 85 years, 10 months, and 25 days after this picture was taken and this certificate came out, the Prime Minister of the day sat in a room and signed a recommendation to the Governor General of Canada that I become the first ever federal deputy minister to be of Chinese Canadian ancestry. And when you think about it, that is in the space of 2 lifetimes, where it was illegal for Chinese people to come here, and to the point where I can be a deputy minister 5 times over. And in many ways, nobody thinks very much of it at all. So I want to talk to you today about a number of things that I hope you'll reflect on, and perhaps even more importantly, ask questions about. I don't intend to talk for an hour. I tend to talk for a lot less than that, because I found over the years that your questions are infinitely more interesting than my speeches. And so I'd love to get to the questions. So please be thinking about those, and please feel free to ask any questions that you would like to. We talk a lot about diversity and inclusion. We talk a lot about equity. And I think we talk about it an awful lot the wrong way. And I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, so what is diversity inclusion? And who has what problem? Who has what issues? The way that we have often gone about thinking about this is that, generally speaking, we have very well functioning systems that are meeting the needs of Yukoners, or meeting the needs of Canadians, or meeting the needs of people from Whitehorse, or whatever government it is that we work for, just fine, thank you very much. But unfortunately, there's some people who feel they have been left by the wayside, and almost as a charitable act, diversity and inclusion is about going, oh yeah, I got to remember while I'm doing my job to bring those people in. But I don't think that's the way that we can or should be thinking about diversity and inclusion. As public servants, we are people who have sworn an oath to do the very best that we can for the citizens who we serve and for the governments that we serve. And that means that if we don't have in the thinking, in the perspectives, in the talent pool, in the life experience that is a part of the team, that is a part of the institution that we're responsible for, that we work in, that can bring the full breadth of knowledge, experience, understanding, sensitivity to understanding the entirety of the population we serve, then we're doing worse for those citizens and worse for the government that we serve than we otherwise could. And that works its way through in a number of different areas. One of the things we do in government is we make policy. We have ideas about what needs to be addressed. We have ideas about how to address them. And we analyze those things. We try to understand those things. We develop policy. But if we don't understand the full population that we're dealing with, if we don't understand how different parts of the populations that we're serving react differently, or why, or have different priorities, or different needs, or different gaps, then any policy that we develop is worse than the policies we develop if we know and understand those things. Now, what sometimes happens in organizations is we'll actually get people into them who have good connections with different parts of our communities that we serve, the citizenry that we serve. But sometimes that drops off when it comes to those who make the decisions, based on the information and analysis that happens by other workers. In other words, you have people who understand the community fairly well, who are doing the first level of analysis and bringing forward recommendations, but the people making the decisions often don't have that same set of connections. There isn't the same breadth of experience, background, understanding, sensitivity amongst that group. And if our decision-making doesn't have those connections, if our decision-making doesn't understand what we're missing, if our decision-making doesn't account for the things that we might not know and know where to go to find those answers, our decisions are by definition worse than if we had known those things. But any of you that work in the world of policy, and any of you who work in the world of operations, know that even the very best of ideas that are developed as a policy will never work exactly the way you expect them to when you get into the world of operations, when you start delivering them. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this is the real world test of the ideas that we had. And it gets very easy to think, well, the reason it's not working out is because the people delivering it just don't understand it. Or it was a really great idea, but the public just doesn't seem to get it, or just doesn't seem to understand it, or some people are just not doing what they're supposed to. But if in the group of people that you have in your institution who are responsible for delivering things, you have people who understand why it's working in some places and why for other groups it's not working. If you can understand what people's fears are, what people's reticence are, what people's experiences are that may be different from many other people's experience, that different in a way that means that the program isn't working for them, and you have people who can tell you why, because again, of their own experience, their own background, their own connections into those communities, you get better answers than if you don't know those things. So the way we would normally see diversity and inclusion is to say, well, listen, we're providing great service. We're doing really good things here at Yukon government, at the Government of Canada, at City Hall in Whitehorse, in whatever regional government, in Indigenous government, at the Band Council office. And you may well be. But if you don't have those understandings, if they aren't built in to the way you analyze a situation, not built into the decisions you make, they're not built into the way you deliver your operations and learn from those problems, every single thing you do will be worse than if you had understood those things. So this is an interesting question. We're usually pretty good at being able to say who we have heard from when we talk about a particular issue. You know, if you're going to change hunting regulations, if you're going to change the speed limit, if you're going to change income tax rates or any of those things, and you ask people, who did you hear from? They're usually really good at telling you. What we're not nearly so good at telling people is, who did you not hear from? What are the gaps? What perspective did you have? There was, a number of years ago, a really famous photo that was taken in the US, and it was a topic of healthcare in the US under the Trump administration. And they took a photo of this room of probably 60 or 70 people who had been called together to talk about the health of Americans, which is by definition, half at least are women. And there wasn't a single woman in the entire room. Now, as Canadians, we feel a little bit smug about that. We think, oh, that's terrible and that's awful, and how could we do that? But one of the questions that we have when we do our work with people who are poor, with people who have had a series of lifelong failures by public institutions to meet the needs of them and their family and their communities, when we have people who have low literacy levels, when we have people who have backgrounds where they have been subjected to different types of discrimination over the years that might or might not have been visible to everybody else. How often have we made decisions that affect them and not even know that we had not brought them into the conversation? We're not as good at remembering who we're not hearing from as we are from knowing who we are hearing from. So I asked every executive in my department to answer 3 questions so they could get their performance pay. And the 3 questions were pretty straightforward in many respects, but they turned out to be really hard. First question, where have we underserved Canada and Canadians? With Yukon government, you might say, where have we underserved Yukoners? Because of who we have not brought to the table in making our decisions. That's a question that very few people have ever asked, I found out, in our system. The idea that if we ask ourselves about the decisions we made, and how could they have been better if we had brought other people into our teams than the people we brought in, to quantify where we didn't do as well as we could. Not as an accusatory thing, not as a gotcha moment, but as a question of we took an oath as public servants to always do our very best. And if we don't believe that it's made any difference to us to not have had Indigenous people, to not have had people of color, to not have had people who reflect the significant percentage of our community that are in the LGBTQ2S plus community. People, for example, who are older, persons with disabilities. If we think that it has made no difference to have not had those people in numbers and able to bring forward their experience, then we probably should give up on trying to think about diversity and inclusion. Because if there has been no problematic result from not having people, there isn't a problem. And you can't fix a non-problem. So it's why I come back to this question of who has what problem when it comes to diversity and inclusion. The second question I asked people was who we need to be attracting and retaining in our organizations have we not been attracting and retaining, and why? And the answers to those things can be quite stunning. If you think about who are the people who have to live with the decisions we make in government, it's the entirety of the population that a government serves. And that means it has to work for that entirety of that population. And that means when we don't have connections to components of that population, the likelihood of us getting it right for them drops dramatically. I think they probably do wonderful public policy, wonderful operations in Spain. I suspect the Spanish government is incredibly competent and has incredibly dedicated public servants. As good as they are, as capable as they are, I wouldn't trust them one bit to make Yukon a better place. Not on their own, because they don't know anything about Yukon. They don't have connections to Yukon. Are they bright, capable people? Of course they are. They dedicated people? I suspect they're every bit as dedicated as each and every one of us on this call. So you can't fault them for those skill sets and those attributes. But their connection to Mayo, their connection to Old Crow, their connection to the realities of the Trontequit Gym, their connection to the world of Ivivik National Park is nothing. And it means they have to make worse decisions than those who have a sense and understanding of those things. And no one person can understand it all. That's why we need teams. And that's why those teams need to bring all of those pieces forward. But we regularly have gaps. And to understand where those gaps are, and more importantly, to understand why. Now, there's a messier side to this. And the messier side is what I got at in the third question. And the question is, what is it that is going on in our organizations that makes it difficult or impossible for people from the groups that we most need to have with us to join, to stay, or to encourage others they know to do the same? And some of you will know that I wrote a letter that got a fair bit of coverage over time. I don't know if Ash has shared it with you or not. There's a video of it as well. And you can certainly get the links if you would like to do that. And in that letter, I simply recounted a number of the experiences that have happened to me over the years. Some before I was a deputy minister, some after I was a deputy minister, some of them extraordinarily recently. And I came up with the math that I'm very, very, very comfortable with that says it's at least 10,000 racist incidents that I've lived with over the course of my life. And that's in no way, shape, or form unusual for literally millions of Canadians. But what's interesting is when I published that letter, and it probably had over 500,000 views on different platforms over time at least, it was 80% of the people who said this is a version of my story. Maybe the details are a little bit different, but it's very similar to me. The other 20% said, I had no idea these things were going on in Canada. Tell you a story that was in the news in the federal government a few years ago. A person at a particular department put up an objectively racist poster, not debatable in any way, shape, or form. It used a term that is only ever objectively racist, and it was used in an intentionally mocking way. So it's not somebody who is quoting some work of literature and there might or might not have been some debate about it. It was used in a deliberately offensive way, and it was an objectively racist term. And it was done in a massive department of tens of thousands of employees, and it was put up in a lunch room on a floor that had hundreds of people in it. And one person complained. One person of color, who is the color of the group that was targeted in the racist poster, not one other person. And what that meant to that person was that my hundreds of colleagues who are on this floor who saw this are telling me that they're not sure if that type of racism in the workplace is a problem at all. What they are sure of is that if it's a problem, it's my problem and my problem alone, and I'm on my own if I want to take it on. And how do I know that? Because not one other person thought to do anything by way of a formal complaint. Now, that gets at what I'm talking about as part of that third question. What is it that's going on in our organizations that makes it difficult or impossible for the people that we need to attract to join, to stay, or to encourage others to do so? I work for a federal department that has allegations and complaints of systemic racism against Indigenous employees. I have been very public in saying that I accept that there have been instances of systemic racism against Indigenous people in my department. I've been in the department for long enough to have witnessed some of them. To be very blunt, the department in a previous reality was responsible for the entire Indian Act, which is an entire distinct piece of legislation targeted only at First Nations people. So we have developed a department that did an entire generation of thinking about how to change Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, with almost no Indigenous people in the room at all. That cannot possibly work well. It cannot possibly have 100 men get together and think about what is the best way to provide maternal supports for women in the workforce. And yet we try to do these things far more frequently than you would imagine. So one of the most important things that I would say any public servant can do anywhere is to ask that simple question, who have we not heard from? And let's look about who is going to have to live with the decisions about what that we're taking here, who's going to have to live with the analysis that we're making here, and do we have some reasonable reflection between the people who have to live with the decisions, to live with the analysis, to live with the operations, and those who are doing the analysis, those who are making the decisions, those who are delivering the operations? Because again, if there's a significant imbalance between the two, we're serving those citizens worse and not better. So One of the things that I would say, ask that question. What is it who is it that we haven't heard from? I think another thing you can do is when you see things that are diminishing colleagues, diminishing other citizens because of their religious beliefs, because of their sexual orientation, because of their ethnic background, because of the beliefs that they bring to the workplace that are informed by thousands of years of indigenous ancestors in this country, be they Inuit or First Nation, or more recently, Métis people over the last 300-400 years. If you see things being done, things being said, if you see gaps that are affecting those citizens and colleagues, don't be silent. Don't go and own the response for them, because it's also wrong to have somebody simply step in and say, well, I will take care of this for you in the way that I see fit. But be available. Let people know that you have seen that poster. Let people know that you have heard that remark. Let people know that what you hear in what they're saying has biases built into it that simply don't have a place in Canada of the 21st century, in Yukon of the first century, and Whitehorse of the 21st century. And support people who are telling you that they feel that they are not being treated as fully and as equally and as equitably as they need to. And I think one of the pieces that in Canada, and particularly Yukon, is critically important for those of us who are not Indigenous. I've always thought a really important exercise, any and every time you find yourself deciding that there is a particular view to some fact or some assessment or some judgment as to the preferences, the objectives, the hopes, the dreams, the fears of Indigenous peoples, ask yourself, who told you that? Because I grew up in a Canada in which Indigenous people never got to speak for themselves. Anything that I learned in elementary school, in high school, and to be blunt, I learned nothing about Indigenous peoples in university. And in fact, there was no opportunity to learn anything Indigenous about Canada's history, Canada's future, Canada's reality in relation to Indigenous people when I went, because it wasn't considered important. It just wasn't there. And what it means is a lot of us have filled in the blanks. We've filled in the blanks with prejudice. We've filled in the blanks with suppositions. We've filled in the blanks with stories that people have told us who weren't Indigenous. The thing that we have done the least, far too frequently, is to fill that understanding with the knowledge, with the experience, with what Indigenous people themselves would have to tell us. And that is, again, I think, a critical test. Anytime we find ourselves thinking about Indigenous, especially if we are non-Indigenous people, ask ourselves, where did I come up with that fact? Where did I come up with that supposition? And was it an Indigenous person? Or were they Indigenous people who brought that to me? Or did I fill in the blank from somewhere else? Because the history of filling in those blanks in this country is not a happy history. It's a history that led to residential schools. It's a history that led to the reserve system. It's a history that led to the pass system. It is the history that tore apart communities and ripped up language and culture and families. That's what happened when we filled in the blanks with other people's stories in the past. Now, that of course doesn't mean that we take the first voice that we hear and assume that's it. It doesn't mean that we pick the voice that we like the most. We simply do what we do everywhere else. We don't go and talk to one person and say, should we raise or lower or keep the same, the speed limit or provincial taxes or pollution levels in rivers. We talk to everybody. Same thing that we need to do when we're deciding what it is that we need to understand and think and evaluate when it comes to Indigenous. To simply do what we have the habit of doing in so many other places. The last thing I want to talk about is a number of you will probably share some of my experience in this regard, and it is the concept of being either the first or one of the few. And it has only come to me in later years, the understanding, at least in part, I'm not all the way there yet, about the additional weight that you carry when you're either the first woman, the first First Nation person, the first Inuk, the first person from Sudan, the first Chinese Canadian to do any number of things. And most people, certainly I, who started that out, I never started out thinking about these things very often. I was a kid out of university who needed a job. I wanted to do something interesting. I landed in the federal government. I was thrilled out of my mind at the opportunity, just like anybody else who had started. But I heard things, I saw things, I lived through things that didn't make sense to me, that I didn't like. Things about what it meant if you were on EI and you were from a particular ethnic group. What it meant if you were in the immigration queue and you were coming from China or some other parts of the world close to there. What I heard about women and whether or not they did or didn't belong in leadership positions. Because when I began my career, it was absolutely understood by a very significant proportion of the population that women had no business in leadership positions. As recently as the beginning of my career, 7% of executives were women in the early 1980s in the federal public service. Today it's over 50%, but it was very unusual. And a lot of the old veteran men felt very free to talk at coffee about how it was a stupid and failed experiment. It was only going to lead to disaster. And in those worlds, it's really hard to decide whether or not you're going to be just like everybody who went before you, or whether or not you're going to stand apart and do something different. And it's really hard sometimes to take on those issues. And you worry an awful lot whether or not you're setting yourself up to be a target, and whether or not you're going to never get another promotion again because people just are tired of hearing from you on these topics. You can get really tired because it takes a lot of effort. There can be a huge emotional toll to it because people who you would have thought would have supported you or would have been allies are sometimes, very surprisingly, more opposed than other people who you would have assumed would have been opposed to what you were talking about. And as hard as it is to take on those issues, sometimes it's even harder to not take them on. And you can feel very guilty for not speaking up when you really rather speak up, but you don't have the energy, you don't have the time. And it's different if there's 16 other people like you and somebody else can pick up that torch. It's very different if you're the only one and you have the sense that people are watching you. Other people who wish they were there so that they could make that set of comments or engagements. And what I'd like to tell those of you who find yourselves as being the first or one of the few, you're the only one who can decide what the right way is to deal with these things. You don't need to feel guilty when you're tired. You don't need to feel guilty when you're uncertain about what this is meaning for your career. You don't need to feel guilty or insufficient when other people say to you, you have a duty to do this. How dare you not bring this forward? And you owe nobody an apology when you stand up and say, we need to do this differently because what we have been doing is wrong. It can be very lonely, being one of the few, being one of the first. I don't think I ever realized how much extra weight I carried over the years because of that. But as I get to the point in my career where I have the privilege, I've been a deputy minister for over 14 years now, of actually being able to use that position and that background to talk about a number of the things that I think are important to talk about. I've started to understand for the first time the weight that I carried. And so if there's something that I can do to point out to those of you who are either amongst the first or the very few, like yourselves, in these positions, then I hope that that allows you to have reflection on what the price is that you sometimes pay for that. Because sometimes you'll ask yourself, why am I so exhausted? And not just exhausted in the way of doing the job, but exhausted because of other reasons. And often that's it. I'll close on this. I've been a deputy minister for 5 times. And in the federal system, and maybe it's the same in Yukon, when you're a deputy minister, they have the photos of all your predecessors going back. And in my most recent department, my current department, that department goes back 150 years. And in all 5 instances, there has never once been a person who looks anything like me on any of those walls. I've been the first person of color on each and every one of those walls. And for 150 years, there wasn't a single person of color on those walls before me. And so I took them all down. I took them all down because if you were an Indigenous person coming into Crown Indigenous Affairs, Crown Indigenous Relations, Northern Affairs, you had to pay the price of walking by photos of people who maybe destroyed your family, who maybe destroyed your community, who maybe destroyed the language that your grandparents spoke, and sometimes infinitely worse than that. And it occurred to me, this is not a price that we should be demanding that Indigenous people pay for the price of having a conversation about reconciliation. One of the great questions is, why did it take me to think that one through? 150 years of predecessors who never once thought about it. This is what we get for having different people come in and bring different thinking to the same old things that we've been doing in the past. And while it isn't perfect, I think it means that we get better results. So I'll leave my remarks there and look forward to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Your words really hit home personally, and just yeah, there's just so much about what you said that I wish we had a lot more time to get into. And speaking as an Indigenous person, especially that last comment was just so striking. You know, I had a question geared up and ready to go, and you actually answered it for me in terms of what can we do as the public service to really ensure that we're incorporating these diverse perspectives, right? These lived experiences. And I think it's just so important for us to incorporate these different perspectives. And so I'm going to encourage people to, again, hit us up with your Q&A. And I see a couple in here. So I'm just going to move through, Daniel, if you'll bear with me with the screen here. So this is the first one we have. It is my opinion that operations within the government are inherently colonial practices. From this perspective, who should we include in conversations about changing approaches to be more inclusive? Internal employees, or should we reach outside? An example might be, we know that our recruitment practices are often limiting. If we are trying, needing, wanting to attract diverse populations, who would sit at our table to promote learning and how to change the recruitment practices?
Yeah, I often use the experience with the change of women in leadership roles and in the public service. So when the year after the year my father, birth father, came to Canada, he arrived 1952, 1953. The very first ever analyst in the federal public service who was a woman was allowed to remain. And when I say allowed to remain, the rules at that time were very simple. Number one, women could only work in clerical positions. That wasn't so much a rule as just it's what happened. You just wouldn't be considered for anything else. Number two, when you got married, you got fired automatically. And that was a rule. And that was a rule a lot of places. A married woman could not work, period. And it wasn't a question, it wasn't whatever. And in fact, Helen Small was this woman's name. And she was an analyst at Treasury Board. You can find, if you look Helen Small up, do a Google search and add Treasury Board of Canada website, you'll find the video. Now, they went either to the Prime Minister or to the President of the Treasury Board, which is the minister responsible for Treasury Board, to get the permission to break the rules so that she could continue to work with the federal government, federal public service, even though she was married. That's how good she was. Now, they found her a different space away from all of the men. And the reason they did that is the boss said, well, sometimes the men use rough language and we sure can't have a lady hearing that. So they put her in an office all on her own. And the new boss wasn't too sure about having a woman. And so he thought, well, what do women like? And he thought, well, women like art. So if you watch the video, what they'll say was, we want to acquire some art after it was a post-war period, acquire a bit of art and make a bit of an art collection for the government of Canada. So because women liked art, he thought that's what he gave her. That collection became the National Gallery of Canada. She is the very foundation of that institution with the art that she went out and acquired. She ended up having a very long career. Her son I worked with in the public service. He might still be working or he might have retired in the last while. But why would I tell that story? I tell that story because you've asked about our hiring practices. There's more in our hiring practices about the similarities of, well, what do women like? Oh, well, we'll put them over here. Or would women feel comfortable in this zone or not? We'll make that decision for them in our current hiring practices than we would like to admit. I often tell people this, if you're doing a job interview for an executive, you ask them a hard question in an interview. And you say, Ash, Ash asked Daniel, says, Daniel, can you give me an instance where you had to decide sort of between what the right thing to do was and what the expedient thing to do was when you know it was going to cause serious problems one way or the other? And if Daniel does this, yes, Ash, I do. And then gives you a brilliant answer. I know what you're already thinking. You think, well, he's hesitant. He took a long. I counted to 10. I did it deliberately. Why? Because there are an enormous number of cultures, including a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada, where it's rude to not give the respect to a questioner of making it clear that you're thinking about the question they asked you. But just be honest with yourselves as you're thinking that, what were you thinking? Well, I was off screen quietly counting to 10. Well, maybe what I was doing was showing you respect. Were you thinking I was hesitant? Were you thinking I didn't really know? Did you think I was fishing around for answers? Because I'll tell you from my own experience, and I'll plead guilty to this. I was growing up is that person should basically be trying to interrupt my finishing of the question to show how well they know the answer. That's a pure value judgment. It has no basis in fact whatsoever. And in fact, if you're going to be working with a lot of those communities in question, maybe it's a better thing that you're showing them respect. Maybe it's a better thing that you're not interrupting what they have to say and you're actually listening to it. Imagine that. But we have views and understandings of what it means to be in the world of good leadership characteristics. Talked a lot about leadership presence at different points in time over the course of my career. And one of the absolutes about leadership presence in the early part of my career, you couldn't have it if your voice was an octave higher than mine. A woman's voice couldn't possibly be considered by many people at the time as having leadership presence. Couldn't have leadership presence at 5'2". Couldn't have leadership presence at 110 pounds. You had to be 6'4". You had to weigh 220. You had to have a deep booming voice. Now, nobody actually ever said those things. It's just that when you looked at who they said had leadership presence, they all looked like that. They all sounded like that. They all weighed that. And so those are the things that we need to think about. Those are the things that when we're hiring, we need to be asking, who am I missing here? When somebody is seemingly very competent and very capable, but you're saying, but I'm not sure that they would fit in here. Really take yourself to task and ask yourself, well, isn't that a good thing? Because if you have to fit in here, and the only way to fit in is to be like everybody else, then you're missing something. You're missing a breadth, you're missing a depth, you're missing connections. Think about who you're trying to serve. And think about, do I have what we need to connect with the totality of that population I'm trying to serve? And that's why I'm not interested in diversity targets, because the targets mask the fact that what we're trying to do is to connect with the publics and the citizenry that we serve. That's what we're trying to do. And if we do that, we will almost certainly have reflected that population who we bring through. But if you think that you're really understanding that population mixing a whole bunch of gaps, go back to that Donald Trump cabinet photo of all men talking about maternal health and ask yourself, is my reaction that, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me? Or are you saying, what on earth were they thinking? And just remember, when you are tempted to say, but these people here, they've all been through the Public Service Commission process, they've all been declared to be fit, they're all the best choice for wherever. Every single one of those men talking about maternal health was also very smart, very capable, had a long life history of accomplishing a whole bunch of great things. And it comes back to that question. When you look at that photo, does it make sense to you? And if it doesn't, to what extent are we doing the same thing with significant parts of the population that we need to serve?
That was a great response, Daniel. I love that perspective. We have a number of questions. I'm going to jump into another one here. How do you feel about responding to Rex Murphy's article? Did you feel it would be dangerous? How did you build your personal strength, your resolve, or resilience to speak to this?
Well, what I've said to lots of people who are people of color or in different communities have found themselves living similar experiences, who said, oh, you had so much courage in writing it. No, didn't have much courage in writing it all. First of all, I didn't write it for anybody else. I wrote it because it was better than throwing something through a wall. I was so frustrated when I read the article, and I didn't write it for anyone else. At first, I just wrote it as therapy. I shared it with family and a couple of really close friends. They felt that it had something useful to add. And then I emailed it to some people. And next thing, I had an aunt who clearly pays way more attention to my media than I do, because she said, Daniel, that's quite the article. And I said, what on earth are you talking about? And she said, sent me the link, and it was in a magazine. And they hadn't talked to me, they hadn't told me, they just went ahead and published it, which I was totally fine with. It's an open letter. The stressful moment for me was hitting send. It wasn't writing it. And the stressful moment around hitting send was because, not for the reasons I suspect most people think. Listen, if it got to 12,000 racist incidents, like, not happy about it, but if you've gone through 10,000, and not much is going to surprise you with another 1,000. Sad thing to say, but true. The hard part about that is, and the worst thing is, indifference. So if I send that out and a bunch of people are friends, or a bunch of people are close colleagues, and they kind of shrug their shoulders and just move on, and it doesn't mean anything to them, we can't have the same relationship anymore. And that's I'm actually more comfortable, in a strange way, with people who are at least willing to own the fact, Daniel, I think that's a bunch of BS and you should quit whining about it. You're in this country now and you're lucky enough, and I don't want to hear about this. There's at least an integrity to owning that view. I disagree with it profoundly. I'll fight against it the rest of my life, but at least there's the integrity of owning that view. What happens far more frequently is people just ignore it. Didn't happen, didn't see it. It's like that place that I was talking about in that department where that poster went up. How does that person look at their colleagues in the eyes again and say, this went up, this went on, this is dead wrong. You have sworn an oath that this is wrong. The law says it's wrong. Our values say it's wrong. And you did nothing. That's way worse than somebody who comes back and say, you know what, I agree with everything that happened to you. I'm glad it happened. I hope it happened again. At least that person has the integrity to own their view. The worst part is when it's simply ignored. So to me, that was actually the hardest part of it. And it's always been the hardest part for me of dealing with racism, is the people who see it and shrug it off. If you're going to see it and sort of own your reaction to it, that's one thing. But if you're going to see it and shrug it off, don't be in the world of claiming to hold the values that are inconsistent with that racist behavior. That's the part that I've always found difficult, because then you have to say to people, listen, if you're going to let this go, I'm not prepared to hear the speeches about how you uphold certain other values that are quite inconsistent with that. And that often gets people really offended. But I think the reality is, if you're just going to let it go by, don't tell me you're opposed to it. Hope that helps.
Yeah, great response. We have a ton of questions here. I'll move to the next one. Any advice on how the first or very few can best deliver the messages to senior management / decision makers that can affect meaningful change on who we need to include on our teams or in conversations? How do we get them to listen and act?
Yeah. I guess what I will say there is absolutely no magic bullet, right? Like that's not going to happen. And that's a difficult thing. I think you keep at it. Keep at it, keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. I think you sometimes have private conversations, or at least one-on-one conversations with people about what is going on, what's real. I think you often have to have an awful lot of stamina about it. I think that what I would say, though, to others is invite those conversations. So there is a federal department that actually invited employees to talk about instances of racism in that department. And that department was blown away by what it found because the department was replete with it. The stories were absolutely heartbreaking and they were current and they were very sincere as well. And so I think that the best thing that we can do, we will at points in time feel the need to say things, but often one of the best things we can do is to create the opportunity to hear things and to figure out what to do with what we've heard. And one of the things that makes that so valuable and so important is that it gets people talking. It gets people talking about what their experience is. And these tend to be things that we live privately. We live them privately often because, as I say in my letter, when it's what I call spectacular, like if somebody calls me, a particular name, which has happened in sort of thousands of instances, that's pretty clear. The burning of a cross somewhere is a very well-known symbol. But somebody walking up to me while I'm a federal deputy minister in a line for immigration at the airport and telling me that I have to leave, a federal public servant for that matter, telling me that I have to leave that line because it's only for Canadian citizens without even checking my passport, what's that? And there's always 1,001 explanations. Oh, they were busy. Oh, they thought they saw a different passport. I don't buy any of it. You came right up to me, not a whole bunch of other people, didn't ask to see my passport, but she told me I wasn't Canadian. Or the people that, as I said in the letter, standing at the airport here in Edmonton waiting for my sister, and somebody came up and said, are you waiting for someone? And of course I was waiting. I said, yeah, and just started screaming at me because she thought I was her taxi driver and was supposed to be, meeting her somewhere else. And again, there are lots of answers that are given as to why that's not really about racism, why it's not really discrimination, why it's not really a big deal, why it's so small. But when people are given the opportunity to talk about those experiences, they realize they're not alone. They realize that it isn't in their head. They realize sometimes in a workplace that, wait a minute, this is pervasive, this is going on, this has driven people away. It may be on the verge of driving the people having the conversation away. That's a bad thing for an institution to lose people for reasons like that. And in public institutions of all places in this country, when there are real problems, we should face them and we should fix them. And listening is the best way to figure out what those are.
There was something that you said earlier, which I think is so important, and I'd be curious on your perspective on this too. So, very often individuals from dominant culture take that perspective where they're kind of blind to instances of discrimination or racism. And rather than trying to kind of do the blame and shame game, trying to kind of educate with grace, if that's the right word, or tact. Do you have any advice in relation to that? Because I think that's just such an important piece where you want to move someone along, but educating appropriately, I guess is my perspective. And I'd be very curious about your thoughts on that.
It's like I found the Kathleen Lake picture just to prove that I was in Yukon in January with colleagues there. Yeah, that's a great question. You know, what we need to do is make sure that we draw from the totality of the population that we have. And if we're going to make sure that we understand that population as a whole, we have to draw from all of it. And that means exactly that. And that means no matter where you are from in the population, there is a place for you or someone like you in responding to the challenges that public institutions have. And so I have had people come to me and say, listen, I'm not really sure there's a place for me anymore in the public service. 10, 15, 20 years ago, I would have been on top of all of these different things. And now, I don't have that. And I think the reaction to that, or the reaction that I'm getting from that, is at one level, I'm concerned that they won't be considered. But what I can tell you is that in every single meaningful metric that I have, I'm under where I should be for what I'm doing. So, in other words, they're underrepresentation of all the people I need to increase the representation for. And given that I've got that underrepresentation, it's not really consistent with an argument that somebody hasn't been given adequate access if they're coming from the place that they're overrepresented vis-a-vis what else we should have. Again, my obligation to Canada and Canadians is to make sure that I serve them as best as I possibly can. I can't do that without understanding them. I can't do that without being connected to them. And again, that is a full set of the population. And it means that I have to have a full and reflective set of people who reflect that population and who are present on the teams that I have and at all of the different levels. But have we done that over the years? No. The beginning of my career, again, 7% of federal executives were women. About literally 0% were people of color. Like, it was so close to zero that you could almost say zero. And so is it the case that as we started to see those positions reflect the Canadian population that we needed to serve, that there was a change in the proportion of the populations that had thoroughly dominated the numbers for a century and a half or century and a quarter, whatever it was? Yes, absolutely. But we don't owe it to Canadians to limit the service that we give them to the understandings that are possible from a legacy of hiring practices that by definition didn't do that. I asked 3 executives a while ago to talk about circumstances where the failure to have included other groups in the solving of the issue led to a manifestly worse set of decisions. And this one executive from Coast Guard brought forward just an absolutely stunningly simple but powerful example. And what she said is that when we first got unionized in 1969 and we're negotiating those agreements, if the unions and if management had had the right number of women in the right positions at that point in time, we would have had a fundamentally different view about part-time work. And I can say this having been the CHRO. The employers generally hate part-time work because you want somebody all the time, all day, every day. You don't want people switching in and out. You don't want people job sharing. You don't want part-time. It means you're not serious about your career. The unions don't like it for a variety of reasons often, and historically have hated it because it's just those jerks in management who are trying to cut back benefits and cut back wages and keep people more desperate so they can do whatever they want to them. That's kind of a summary of the view. But if you talk to women and you talk about how our society unfairly apportions homework, family care, and so many other things on women, What many women will tell you is that, at least for periods of their lives, the only meaningful way that they can contribute in the labor force is to work part time. That if they work full time, they'll, in some instances, pay more in childcare historically than they would have been able to bring home had they worked full time. What an enormous and horrible cost to Canada that has been. How many brilliant engineers do we lose? How many brilliant lawyers do we lose? How many women didn't have pension plans or dental plans that could otherwise have had them because we thought that working part time meant you weren't serious, or it was just an attempt to, drop people's wages? Those can be legitimate concerns. I'm not saying that, but we never even had the conversation. Why didn't we have the conversation? Because none of the people who were doing the negotiation had the slightest connection to those realities. So we're not under an obligation to continue the inability to understand those issues as a matter of fairness. What we do have an obligation to do is to make sure that when we talk about those issues, we have people that represent the totality of those who are going to have to live with the fullness of those decisions that we make in those types of negotiations and those types of agreements. That means everyone has a place.
Great perspective. You raised some great points here, Daniel. Very cognizant of time here, and we have a ton of questions. I don't think we're going to get to them all, but we're going to try our best here. So what advice would you give to allies and diversity, equity, inclusion workers who are trying to manage up to leadership?
Yeah, speak up, I think, is the issue. Ask questions. I think one of the questions about, like, who have we not heard from here is a very powerful and sometimes less threatening question. And to get into the instinct of asking, who have we not talked to? Who have we not heard from? What perspectives don't we have? And the question that flows from that was, do we have the right people here to help us understand and connect? And how can we get that? I think sometimes if you do like an after action type review of something you were working on, what were the gaps we had in our skill sets in understanding these issues, these perspectives, in making the right connections to these matters? And if you continue to bring that up frequently enough, I think that helps make an impact. I think there are those moments when things are plainly wrong and plainly problematic that you actually need to stand up and say, wait a minute, this is wrong. And if you are an ally, and you're wondering if something is an issue, talk to people who you think might be thinking about this as well. And if they're going to go, don't let them go alone. If they're going to raise the issue, be there, make it clear that you are putting yourself out there too on that particular issue.
For sharing that. I have a really interesting question here, and it's related to, do you have any advice about how we incorporate lived experience as a competence for recruiting in communities?
Yeah. Again, and I come back to this question of, do we understand how to listen to the people that we need to hear from? Do we actually understand who we're missing from the equations? Right. So, to use a well-known but still very powerful example of it, when the British colonial administration came over, it did what it always did. It spoke to the men who were in leadership positions, didn't, talk to any of the membership, and for goodness sake, wasn't going to listen to anything women had to say, because there was an entire frame of reference. But what if there had been somebody who said, I think we're missing something from the women here that we haven't heard of? or if there was somebody who actually knew enough to know, listen, the richness of this conversation isn't with the people who are having it. The real richness is with the people that we haven't heard from yet, and we need to go talk to them. We wouldn't try to deal with fiscal reform or banking regulation reform without having somebody who understood the banks and the banking process. In fact, we hard bake it right into the requirements. So when we're dealing with mental health issues, when we're dealing with human trafficking issues, when we're dealing with MMIWG issues, for example, one of the questions is, to what extent do we have people that are comfortable interacting with, that understand the nature of the interactions with the people that we're dealing with? Or are they all like me and people for whom this is completely outside the realm of anything that I've ever lived? And if it's only people like me working on that, again, that is an enormous disservice to those who need that care, attention, support, and work from government.
So much. Psychological health and safety is a very, very important topic. And our next question relates a bit to that. Do you have any tips to recover or heal from the burnout in dealing with bias? As a person of color, it can be hard to always be the one raising your voice and being on the receiving side of these instances. What do you do to remain healthy, well, and happy while facing discrimination?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and unfortunately, a daily reality, probably for millions of Canadians. Um, there's no magic bullet to that. I do think, we all have our own strategies for addressing that and the ways that we address it. I think having other people who understand elements of those realities with whom we can talk is important. One of the things that I was immensely surprised by, and if you follow it on Twitter, like if you just look Daniel Quan Watson up on Twitter and just see sort of some of the conversations going, like there are cabinet ministers, former cabinet ministers who talked about having had very similar experience, dentists, doctors, others, and people who were clerks at stores. And what I think we'll find is when we have those conversations is, number one, we didn't imagine it. And you may be in this conversation thinking, what on earth is that talking about? But for those who have lived it, one of the powerful senses is like, did I imagine that? Am I making too much of this? And to hear other people and have understand that they're saying, no, I had a very similar experience. You didn't imagine this. To just know that other people are also there or have been there is in and of itself a huge weight. It's not sufficient, but it's an important piece. I think, as I said in the opening part of my remarks, be gentle with yourself about not taking on the fights that you feel like you probably should be taking on. No human being can fight everything all day, every day. It just doesn't work. But it also doesn't let up necessarily the things that you have to live through, the things that you hear, the things that you see, the things that are baked into systems that you maybe don't have an opportunity to change or can't imagine having an opportunity to change. And not beating yourself up for not being able to take those on at that point in time, I think is a big part of that. For me, I had the picture of my grandfather up there. I sometimes take great solace from the fact that I am in a position to, I mean, here I am talking to you as an invited speaker. I've written legislation. I've been sort of in front of parliamentary committees talking about these things that he couldn't even be a citizen. He couldn't even choose what part of Victoria he was going to live in. He couldn't vote until he'd been here for almost 25 years. So part of me is inspired by his example. And part of me is sometimes reminded that I have the enormous privilege, and always have, long before I became a deputy minister, to stand up, to speak up, and to take on things that he would never in 1,000 years have had the opportunity to do during the course of his lifetime. And while that is not sort of a quid pro quo, everything is fine because I can do this, it is at different points in time something that I go back to and am reminded of when I get to some of my more challenging moments on this front.
Mr. Quan Watson, I'm going to end it there just in respect for our time. Apologies to everyone for not getting to your questions. There's been so much interest in our conversation here this afternoon. Mr. Quan Watson, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege. We're going to have to do this again. I have your contact information. I will bug you, so please don't go far. Thank you for sharing your lovely picture of Kathleen Lake. Very inspiring. Wants me to get out and do a hike again. And again, thanks to all our participants. We have a great shot of the lake, and there's a great backstory there. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind words.
I'd much rather have been there in person,
Yes.
but I had to stop in Edmonton. So there you go. Someday.
Yeah, we're going to get you back up here.
Okay. Well, take care, and my best wishes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone online. Appreciate it.
Bye now.
Bye.